school graduation was this morning because otherwise I'd be there. And I'm going to talk today about a paper I wrote with my colleague, Dr. Charles Davis, on international television co-productions and the cultural discount. And this is a case study of a television series that I created and produced called Family Biz. And next slide, please. So what we looked at was transnational productions, and we defined them as basically having three different types. First, simple production outsourcing, where a studio in Los Angeles, let's say, decides to produce a series in another territory to take advantage of lower costs or financing that's available, like tax credits. Secondly, formatting, which is becoming increasingly important, and that's where you have a series like In Treatment or Homeland or Big Brother that has succeeded in one market and done very well, and then the producers sell the rights to a second territory or third territory, as many territories they like, to produce a local version of that show. And that goes both crossing the Atlantic, both from the U.S. to other territories and from other territories to the U.S. And third, and this is the one that describes Family Biz, joint venturing, an international co-production. That's where you have two producers in two different countries working together to produce a series, and then hopefully sell that series to the rest of the world. Next. The challenge with co-venturing or with any production is the cultural discount, as described by Hoskin and Miras, and also further described by Lee. The idea is that, yes, there are advantages to co-production, which I'll talk about in a minute, but that media product loses its value once it crosses the border. I'm producing a show for Canada. It reflects my values. It reflects my culture. Those values, those cultural ideas have less value, less interest to people in other countries. Media product is valued less by a foreign audience, and especially by the buyers of the networks in that foreign territory. Next. So Family Biz is a case study. And through this, I'll give you just a glimpse of the operational complexity of product innovation while you're leveraging these co-production devices. And not only is there a cultural discount when you make a product in one territory and then sell that show in another territory, but by doing a co-production, there's actually a double cultural discount. It compounds the problem. Next. So in terms of methodology, as the creator and executive producer of the series, I had complete access to all the materials, to all the contracts, to all the documents, to all the decisions. So this is really first-hand observation from the inside of the process. Next. The actual show was a half-hour tween comedy, and it was about a dad who was a businessman who loses his job and starts to work from home, and then he applies everything he learned from the world of business to the business of parenting and destroys his teenagers' lives. It's autobiographical. So that was the basic idea of the show. When we proposed this to the networks, we were very much aware of our competition. And those were the big Nickelodeon and Disney shows, Hannah Montana, Wizards of Waverly Place, iCarly, and the marketing machine, both Disney and Nickelodeon, behind those properties. The U.S., in most genres of television and feature films, is the lead exporter in the world. It sets the aesthetic and commercial standard. So you're always competing and always keeping an eye on what are the U.S. markets doing, what are their productions. Next, please. Now, the advantages of co-production are real. We were able to raise more production financing. The co-production treaties are set up to help smaller markets like Canada, and co-venturing can help even the U.S. in spreading the risk of producing very expensive art forms like feature films and television, to spread that risk across the world. Because not even the U.S. as a market today can support its own properties without international sales or international co-productions. By Family Biz, by being an international pre-sale to France, we qualified as European content, and we fit within European quotas, which meant that the value of the license for France was higher than it would have been if we had just sold the show as what's called an acquisition to France 2. And by doing it as a France-Canada co-production, we ended up with two different versions, one in English and one in French, and therefore the French version could be more easily sold to other French territories without the additional cost of doing another dub. However, this came with some complexity. Next slide, please. So as you can see from the players, we had two French broadcasters, a Canadian specialty channel, YTV, 3 production companies, one in Toronto, that was my company, one in Quebec, which was Muse, and a French co-producer in Paris, Breakout, and we were shooting in a 4th territory. So if you can, fourth center, Ottawa. So if you can imagine the communication that was used and how complicated that was just to get simple approvals of scripts. Now, in comparison, let's look at the financing for Lost, the American TV series. Next slide, please. So Lost was financed basically by Disney, and 60% came from ABC, which was owned by Disney, the network, and 40% came from Disney's distribution arm, Touchstone. So basically, one company's doing all the financing. Next. CSI is an example of a transnational production sharing the risk, where 80% came from CBS in the States through the network and the production arm, but 20% of the financing came from Alliance Atlantis, a Canadian company, who shared the risk. Okay, so now let's look at Family Biz's financing structure. So let's go to the next slide. There were 14 different sources of financing. So yes, transnational financing raises the money, but at a cost of time and transactional costs. Next slide, please. So our financing came from various tax credits from 2 Canadian provinces, Canada, the federal government of Canada, and France's equivalent of tax credits, plus a number of broadcasters, plus a number of funds, plus an international distribution sale, plus the producers themselves investing in the series. So by having 14 different sources of financing, it took us 4 years to raise this money, which is not unusual when you're talking about transnational productions that are using co-production structures. Next. So, how does the cultural discount play into this? As producers, we first had to try to avoid diminishing the value of the show for our own markets. So we wanted the show to work both in Canada and in France. And this was a problem because France is not Canada, as we discovered. It's very different. And so assuming we could avoid the cultural discount for the main partners, how could we then avoid having a further discount for third parties, especially the US? Now, this was of extreme importance to me because the profit for this show that would have bought me a new car was coming out of the US. Like, we all did well in terms of making the show, selling it to France and Canada, but the home run was if we could sell it to the US. And we came up against this double cultural discount. Next. Okay, so if we could just play the clip of Family Biz so that you can have a sense of what it looked like.
How's the strike going, honey?
Well, they'll be back to the negotiating table soon, on my terms.
Ooh, hey. I'm management. You're labor. Can we even be seen together?
No one needs to know. Nice.
You better go, honey.
Yeah, definitely. But we're gonna continue our negotiations later. No respect, no laundry. No respect, no dinner. No respect, no this. Union brother coming through, son. I am not a number, I am a free man. Strike, strike, strike! Strike, strike, strike! Strike, strike, strike!
Okay, so that's just a very short clip, and we did 26 episodes, and we went down and we met with Disney. Disney watched about half the series, and we met with Disney innumerable times. At least I had 4 meetings in Los Angeles with Disney to try to sell the show, and they gave it a lot of consideration, as did Nickelodeon. But in the end, the double cultural discount precluded that sale. And the final sentence where I knew that we would never sell the show to Disney was when one of the executives said about our lead actress who played the teenage girl, she's not like our girls. And in terms of casting, that was probably the most difficult issue to avoid the cultural discount between Canada and France, because what France wanted was an older teenager, more worldly, more gawky, not a pretty girl. Canada wanted to go more to the US model, but was happy with the French decision. But in the end, it was the casting of that lead actress, who did a very good job, that prevented the sale. Next slide, please. So on the left, you'll see Kate, who played Avalon, our lead, and then you'll see Hannah Montana, who many of you have seen. And younger, cuter, more brightly lit. If you notice on the left, there is what's called a sky, a blue sky. The US tween sitcoms are never shot outdoors. They're always on studio sets, 3-camera interiors. The fact that we shot outdoors to help for the French sale and the Canadian sale actually hurt us on the US sale as well. Next slide. Between France and Canada, some of the issues that took up a lot of time and energy and affected the value of the show both in Canada and France were cross-cultural. For instance, in France, no one eats peanut butter sandwiches. And we had a story about the kids bringing a peanut butter sandwich to school. Peanut butter sandwiches are not allowed at Canadian schools because of allergies. France, they don't acknowledge that kids have allergies. So we had to lose that story. That didn't cost us a lot of money or time, but when the clip that you saw where the dad is holding up the words strike, 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 he's saying strike, 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 he's holding up a placard with the word strike, that was a huge battle between France and Canada. France, even though the series was set in Canada, they did not want their audience to see English words on screen because they thought that their audience would lose interest and not think it was about them, that it was about someone else. So we had to be very careful how many times we used an English word on screen. It's very hard to get across the idea that someone is on strike unless they're holding up a sign which says strike. And we could not find anything other than the English word strike. And this was a problem for France, but they agreed finally to work with us on that. The other interesting question was, where is the mom from? Originally, to make this a co-production, we had proposed that the mom be from France and the family be basically Canadian. That way there'd be a French actor playing the French part and Canadians playing the Canadian parts. France did not want the mom to be from France because they said once you dub it into French, no one's going to know she's from France. So I said, okay, we'll make the mom from South America. Let's make her from Colombia. And the reason I picked Colombia is because my daughter had a friend whose parents were from Colombia. And I realized that the Colombians that I knew in Canada were very different than the Colombians that the French broadcaster knew in France. And they did different jobs, they had different attitudes and so on. And we're all deal with our own national prejudices. So in the end, the mom is from somewhere in South America. We never say where. Okay? So we just avoid the whole thing. And by the way, in terms of the U.S. market, this turned out to be a benefit because the U.S. market is a huge Hispanic population. So a number of the Disney shows have moms who are Hispanic. Wizards of Waverly Place being an example. Next. So what happened to Family Biz in the end? In the end, Family Biz did not go to season 2. France, too, loved the show. They felt it served their older demographic. They actually wanted to do another season. YTV looked at the U.S. shows and moved to a younger demographic. There was a live action show that YTV did at the same time as Family Biz that was renewed, but that show, How to Be Indie, only had one master. They only had to satisfy YTV. Therefore, they could make it so that it worked specifically for the Canadian market and not worry about peanut butter, not worry about where the mom came from, and so on. The very next show that YTV, our broadcaster, ordered was Life with Boys, which was a Disney-style 3-camera sitcom that never went outside, that hired the creators of Hannah Montana to make the show. So co-venturing is a solution for the Canadian market, and YTV saw that solution as co-venturing directly with U.S. talent and U.S. networks in order to make the show. I should say that Life with Boys only lasted 2 seasons because when you work with Disney and Disney creators, they are more expensive than if you work with local creators. Next slide, please. So the U.S. market is really an interesting market right now, and it's much more open to co-venturing and co-producing than it was 10 years ago. And this works especially well with dramas and cop shows like Flashpoint, Rookie Blues. Degrassi's a drama that's just been ordered by Netflix and Family Channel in Canada. But dramas generally travel better than comedies. Next slide, please. Oh, 1 second. So is there still the question of cultural discount? If you work directly with the U.S., with U.S. network support and their input and their resources, can you avoid, if you produce a show in Canada or Colombia or Britain, can you avoid the cultural discount for that U.S. market, which is a huge market and very important? And the way that it seems to work in the case of shows like Rookie Blue and Saving Grace and Flashpoint is those shows never mention Toronto. And in Canada, we call those Anywhere USA shows because Toronto stands in for Boston or for an unnamed U.S. city. Oh, sorry. That's my 20, I'm almost done. That was my 20-minute warning. I apologize. But the problem is even if you work with the U.S., because it's produced outside of the U.S., and Canadian culture or Colombian culture or British culture somehow creeps in, it's still devalued by the US buyers. And Les Moonves, in referring to Rookie Blue and Saving Grace and Flashpoint, said, whatever these shows are, they are still cheap summer filler. These are the shows we buy cheap and that we run in the summer when there are fewer viewers watching. Okay. Next slide. So, is co-venturing the solution? There is one more possibility of hope, which I will offer to you. And if some people argue, if you get closer to U.S. content, then you can co-venture with the U.S. However, I would argue, next slide please, I would argue that Netflix and other over-the-top transnational broadcasters are a real solution to the cultural discount or even the double cultural discount. If you can sell a show like Degrassi or Trailer Park Boys, which are firmly set in a local market, in a local culture, and talk about your world and your stories, if you can sell them to a Netflix, which is a transnational broadcaster, you circumvent the entire problem. Because what Netflix seems to be looking for are locally produced shows that speak to a local audience and therefore have something of value that can transcend all borders. And the little show on the right, or my right, with The Girl and the Cat, that's a show that last year I helped sell to Netflix, a kid's show called True and the Rainbow Kingdom, which is set in a world which is neither Colombia, nor Canada, nor France, nor the US, but seems to work for everyone. So I want to thank you very much. And final slide, I also want to thank the funding agencies that provided Charles and I the resources to write this paper. Thank you. Okay, so I guess I'll say goodbye. Oh, we have questions. Okay, great. Okay, I didn't know. Okay. Well, first of all, it's actually some of that is used in Canada to Canadian advantages. I'm thinking of Heartland, which is set in Alberta in horse country, and there is a hunger in Europe to see open spaces. So there's some advantage to showing the beauty of a particular country, though as touristy as that might be. Netflix actually is very hands-off on content, which is really interesting. If they have confidence in the show, they just simply order the show for 13 or usually 13 episodes, and then they say, go do it. And they sign off pretty much early on. To get them to sign off at the beginning is quite difficult because they're going to be putting in a large investment up front, and they'll allow the show to run for 13, bingeable to run for 13 or I think 20 is the most they've done episodes. So I don't think that they worry so much about that. I think it's more the local broadcasters who worry about regionalism and making sure that we show the regions of our smaller countries. That's where Heartland is set in Alberta or 19.2 is set in Montreal, because there's the idea that we need to show all the regions and not just the big central cities like London or Toronto.
Thank you. Hi there.
Hi.
I was wondering if it's too hard, like to work with the U.S. in a joint venture, like you were talking. Like I would imagine for us Latin Americans that they will feel like superior or something like that, and that in order to avoid the cultural discount, you would have to Americanize your product.
I think that's a very good point. It really depends on which U.S. entity you are working with. Years ago, I worked on a show called Zach Files, and we had 6 broadcasters from 5 different countries that were all involved in the production. But the U.S. only put in 10% of the financing, but they had 90% of the voice. And often, smaller countries will defer to the U.S. judgment because it's felt that if Disney is working on this, Disney really knows the international market. They've had the success of Hannah Montana or Phineas and Ferb or whatever. Therefore, we should defer to them. That is a problem. In terms of Americanizing, yes, they will do that. They will, if you're shooting in English, they will object to the accent. I speak with a Canadian accent. I cannot tell the difference between my accent and an American accent, but Americans can. And they will actually ask you to redub certain portions of the production if it sounds too Canadian. So that does happen, and it's getting better. It's getting better, and it depends on which network you're working with, which U.S. entity you're working with, and the amount of their influence. If you're working in the science fiction world with sci-fi, and you're bringing most of the money from the international markets to the production, they're pretty hands-off, as an example. Disney, who are very good at what they do, they are very involved. And yes, they want everything to be American because they don't want the cultural discount. They don't want the show not to feel American for their audiences.
Thank you.
Well, I enjoyed your talk. I teach at the University of Ottawa, and I study Canadian media, and I'm American. So everything about your talk was very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
So I've spent the last 5 or 6 years writing a book about Little Mosque on the Prairie and interviewing all of the people involved in the production with that. So there's everyone at West Wind Pictures in Toronto, and one of the things that they talked about was to make a Canadian show for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, they had to invest about $1 million of their own money for each season and then get that back through international sales. So for a domestic Canadian show on the national broadcaster, they had to rely on international funding, which is one of my favorite paradoxes of the show. But I was wondering, so you partnered with YTV, which is commercial, and with France 2, which is public. And I'm wondering what your experience was, if there's a difference in dealing with public broadcasters versus private broadcasters.
Actually, the differences are very small. The broadcasters, and I don't want to sound, and by the way, to me it's absolutely natural that you should have international sales to support your show. We certainly did on Family Biz, and though I have to say that we did make a profit, a small profit. But in terms of France 2, because they were a public broadcaster, and this is peculiar to French public broadcasters, they did not want any episodes that involved any religious discussion. So one of our characters was a 13-year-old girl. We proposed an episode where she had her bat mitzvah, and they said, no, that would be a nice episode, but we're a public broadcaster, so we have to be secular, so we cannot show any religious services. That's very specific to France. In terms of what all broadcasters want, is they do want great shows. And whether they're private or public, They're looking for shows that engage people emotionally, that make them laugh, and so on. Little Mosque, I hope they didn't defer their fees in hopes of getting international sales. That's how you go bankrupt.
No,
It's much better, like we had our international sales in our financing plan.
right. They were. I don't know if you've met Mary Darling and Clark Donnelly, but they're very smart. They're.
Yeah.
Well, I have many more questions to ask you, but I might just knock on your door in Toronto sometime if that's all right.
Well, and I'll be in Ottawa on May 31st if you want to email me and have a coffee.
I will definitely email you.
Okay. Yeah,
I have lots more questions.
I have a meeting with Heritage to discuss Canadian content, which is touched on in this paper.
That's the other question I wanted to ask you, but we have other presentations, so I'll email you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, James, thank you very much. It's been
Oh,
great
thank
seeing
you.
you.
Okay, I'm signing off. Okay, bye.
Bye.